There's a photograph that never made it into any magazine. It was taken backstage in Houston, Texas on a February evening in 1970. The flash had already fired. The film had captured what it needed. But the photographer, a young man on his first major assignment, later said he couldn't bring himself to submit it. Not because it was unflattering, not because it was blurry, but because it showed something he felt the world had no right to see. In the image, Janis Joplin is sitting alone, not performing, not laughing, not mid-sentence in one of the wild, sprawling interviews she was known to give. She is simply sitting, 20 minutes before a show, in a folding chair under a bare bulb, looking at something just outside the frame that no one in the room could identify afterward. Her hands are in her lap, her feather boas and beaded. Necklaces catch the light, her eyes do not. And what she said that night to a journalist who had come backstage for a pre-show conversation would not be printed for decades. Not because it was scandalous, not because it was strange, but because it was so quiet, so plainly true that no editor at the time knew what to do with it. "I'm not lonely on stage," she told him, almost as an aside, the way people say things they've been holding for a long time without realizing it. "I'm lonely everywhere else." The journalist changed the subject. Janis let him. 20 minutes later, she walked out under the lights and became the loudest, most alive person in the building. A voice that could strip paint and break hearts simultaneously. An audience that screamed her name like a prayer. And somewhere in the middle of it all, somewhere between the roar of the crowd and the heat of the spotlights, the woman who had said that quiet, devastating sentence disappeared entirely into the performance. This is the story of how she got there, and what it cost her to stay. Port Arthur, Texas, in the 1950s was a town that knew exactly what it expected from its children. It expected them to be manageable, to move within the lines drawn by geography, by religion, by the particular brand of social order that defines small Gulf Coast communities in post-war America. Janis Lynn Joplin was born on January 19, 1943, into a family that was, by most accounts, decent and thoughtful. Her father, Seth Joplin, was an engineer at Texaco who read books and thought carefully about the world. Her mother, Dorothy, was organized, capable, devoted. They were not the villains of this story. No one in Port Arthur was. But Janis was not a manageable child. From the beginning, there was something in her that refused to be contained, not out of deliberate rebellion, but out of sheer excess. Too much feeling, too many thoughts arriving at once. She painted, she drew, she read voraciously. She sang in the church choir with a voice that the other members found unsettling, not because it was bad, but because it was too much, too present, too hungry for something the hymns weren't quite offering. She gravitated toward the edges, toward the kids who listened to blues records and felt, as she did, that the world was larger than their zip code suggested. The cruelty she experienced in those years was ordinary in the worst sense of that word, delivered through laughter and exclusion, the particular casual violence of adolescence, but something important happened in those years that the cruelty was never able to reach. She found the music, not school music. She found Bessie Smith, Lead Belly, Big Mama Thornton. She found the blues, a form built on the precise emotional territory she had been living in without knowing it had a name. Here was music that did not require you to be manageable. Here was music that said, your pain is real, your longing is real, the size of what you feel is not a flaw. She began to sing it in private first. Then in small rooms for small audiences, and even then, even in those early, unformed performances, the people who heard her understood that something unusual was happening. Not technique, not polish, something rower and more necessary than either of those things. But Port Arthur didn't have a word for what she was. And so, at 19, she left. By 1966, she was back in San Francisco, and this time she stayed. Big Brother and the Holding Company was a band looking for a singer. Janis Joplin was a singer looking for a sound large enough to hold her. What happened when she first rehearsed with the band, the moment her voice filled that small rehearsal space and the musicians looked at each other with expressions of pure shock, has been described by multiple people who were there. Something arrived in that room that hadn't been there before. Something that changed the atmospheric pressure of the space. She was 23 years old. She had been trying to get here her entire life, and she had no idea yet what getting here would demand in return. The years between Monterey and 1970 moved at a velocity that left very little room for stillness. Albums, tours, performances in venues that grew larger. With each cycle, magazine covers, A face and a voice that had become, almost overnight, a cultural shorthand for something difficult to name precisely: freedom, maybe, or authenticity, or the particular courage of refusing to be anything other than what you were. She was extraordinary at all of it. Every performance carried the same quality that had silenced the crowd at Monterey: the sense that something real was happening, that the emotion was not manufactured but extracted from an actual interior life at considerable personal cost. The audiences felt it. They responded with a devotion that went beyond ordinary fandom. People came to Janis Joplin concerts the way people went to things they needed, not just things they wanted. What the audiences couldn't see was the other side of that transaction. Giving that much, night after night, requires having that much to give. The same interior depth that made the performances extraordinary also made the silence afterward unbearable. The same capacity for feeling that translated so powerfully on a stage had no off switch when the stage lights went down. Fame had given her visibility, validation, the particular satisfaction of having the world finally confirm what she had always suspected, that she had something real to offer. Those were not nothing. She understood their value. But fame had also given her something it always gives, which is the illusion that it will fill a specific kind of empty space. It does not fill that space. It illuminates it. She knew this. She had known it for a while. She just hadn't said it out loud yet. His name was Richard Dorset, and he was 24 years old. He had been sent by a music publication to get a pre-show interview with Janis, 10 minutes, maybe 15, the kind of piece that runs alongside a concert review. He had prepared questions on an index card, slightly crumpled in his left hand, when he was finally allowed backstage at the Houston venue that February evening in 1970. He found her in a small room off the main corridor. A folding chair, a mirror with lights around it that were not turned on, a half-eaten meal on a plastic tray. The feather boas already in place, the bracelets already on her wrists, the Southern comfort already nearby, the things that were always in place before she became the version of herself the audience was waiting for. She greeted him the way she greeted most journalists, with expansive, performative warmth that was partly genuine and partly a mechanism. She was good at interviews. She gave publications the Janis Joplin they were expecting to find. Dorset asked his prepared questions. She answered them. The piece would have been perfectly serviceable, and then at some point he could never afterward pinpoint. Something shifted. The questions ran out, or she stopped hearing them as questions. The recorder was still running, but the interview had loosened into something else. She looked at the mirror that wasn't lit. She said something offhand about the set list. And then, without any particular emphasis, she said it. "I'm not lonely on stage, I'm lonely everywhere else." Dorset told the story decades later in a small interview that ran in a music journal tracking him down for a retrospective. He said the room went very quiet after she said it. Not an uncomfortable quiet, just the kind that falls when something true has been stated, and everyone needs a moment to absorb it. He changed the subject, he said, because he didn't know what to do with it. He was 24. He had an index card. He was not equipped for what had just happened. "She let me," he said. "She didn't push it. She just let me change the subject and went back to being the person she was supposed to be in interviews." The piece that ran did not include the line. He had not been able to figure out how to write around it, or through it, or past it. It sat in the middle of the transcript like something too heavy to move. And so he left it out, wrote the profile that was expected, and thought about that sentence for the rest of his life. What she had said was not a complaint, not a plea. It was the kind of observation that arrives when someone has reached enough clarity to see their own situation. Accurately, the stage was where she was most herself, most present, most alive, most connected to something that felt like its own answer. And everywhere else, in the corridors, in the folding chairs, in the rooms that were not quite dressing rooms, she was somewhere else entirely. It was not a secret she had been hiding. It was a truth she had not previously found the words for. To understand what she meant, it helps to understand what she was when she performed. Not the image, the feather boas, the whiskey bottle, the wild hair, but the actual interior experience, as described by the people who knew her well enough to talk about it. Her guitarist Dave Getz once said that watching Janis perform was like watching someone who had found the one place where the rules of ordinary human limitation didn't apply. She wasn't performing emotion. She was processing it in real time, in public, at volume. Every show was a kind of excavation. She went down into something and came back with whatever she found there and gave it directly to the audience without filtering it first. This was the source of the power. It was also the source of the cost. Excavation is exhausting, and doing it in public for audiences that grew larger each year created a pressure with no obvious release valve. The audience needed more each time. The performances needed to be bigger, more exposed, more generous, and each time you give everything, you have to find a way to have everything again by the next night. The loneliness she described to Dorset was not simply the loneliness of being misunderstood. It was the loneliness of being known only at maximum volume, of having your truest self visible only in the moments. Of maximum exposure, the people who came to the shows connected with something deeply real, but they connected from 30 rows away, in the dark while she stood in the light, and when the lights went down, the connection dissolved. She had tried in those years to find the ordinary kinds of connection that ordinary life offers, friendships, some deep and lasting, relationships that held more genuine warmth than the public record reflects. She was, by accounts of people closest to her, enormously funny, genuinely curious, capable of an attentiveness that made people feel seen in ways they weren't accustomed to. But the gap between the stage and the corridor was real, and she felt it every time. She walked onto the Houston stage 20 minutes after the interview ended. The show was, by every account, extraordinary. Something in the performance carried an additional intensity, as if the quiet thing she had said in the folding chair had not diminished her but clarified her, stripped away something no longer necessary, left only the essential. She sang the way she always sang, from somewhere beneath technique, beneath strategy, beneath the careful management of image and expectation. She sang from the place the loneliness came from. And in doing so, she turned that loneliness into the opposite of itself, at least for the duration of the performance. She made 30,000 strangers feel, for a few hours, completely not alone. That was what she did. That was the specific and irreplaceable thing. Bessie Smith had done this. Ma Rainey had done this. The blues tradition she had drawn from was built precisely on this, the idea that music could be a vessel for the most difficult human experiences, that giving voice to suffering was not surrender but power. Janis Joplin understood this not as theory but as practice. The Houston audience didn't know about the folding chair. They didn't know about Dorset or the index card or the sentence that would not be printed. They knew only what they could see and hear: a woman on a stage, giving everything, holding nothing back. The sentence stays: I'm not lonely on stage, I'm lonely everywhere else. Not because it is a tragedy, though the distance it describes costs something real, but because it is the truest possible articulation of what it means to be the kind of artist she was, to have your deepest self available only in moments of maximum exposure, to be most alive in the space that is also most public. She was 26 when she said it. She had 8 more months. The Pearl album would be finished. Me and Bobby McGee would become what it became. The voice would outlast the body, which is what voices do when they have something real in them. They find their way into the world and stay there, generation after generation, carrying whatever truth they were made of into rooms and ears and moments the singer never lived to see. Every generation since 1970 has found her. Not because she has been aggressively marketed, but because the thing she was doing in those recordings is the kind of thing that doesn't expire. It speaks to something that doesn't change between generations. The need to hear someone tell the truth about what it actually feels like to be alive. Young women, in particular, continue to find her not the mythology of the tragic figure, which is the version that flattens everything, but the actual thing. Woman who refused to make herself smaller, who sang from a place of complete honesty, who stood on stages and told the truth about what she felt and dared the audience to recognize themselves in it. The Houston interview is not a footnote to the career. It is a key to it, because what she was describing in that quiet moment in the folding chair was exactly the paradox that made her extraordinary. The stage was where she was most connected, most alive. And everywhere else, everywhere the performance wasn't, she was looking for the same thing the audiences were looking for when they came to her shows. She was looking for the feeling of being completely understood by someone who was close enough to touch. She gave it to everyone. She was still searching for it herself. The show ended the way her shows always ended: standing ovation, the lights coming up slowly as if the venue was reluctant to return to ordinary time. People standing in the aisles, not quite ready to leave. She took her bows, the wide, slightly theatrical bows she had developed over years of performing, the ones that managed to be both genuine and a little ironic at the same time. She waved. She smiled the big smile that photographed so well, the one that lit up her whole face. Then she walked off stage. The corridor was narrow and slightly cold, the way backstage corridors always are in large venues, functional spaces designed for transit, not for inhabiting. The roar of the audience was still audible through the walls, the crowd not yet dispersed. Dorset was still there. He saw her walk past, still in the feather boas, still in the bracelets, the makeup beginning to soften in the heat of the performance. He raised his hand in a small wave. She stopped. "Did you get what you needed?" she asked. He said he had. She nodded. And then for just a moment she looked back toward the stage, toward the now empty space where 30,000 people had been holding their breath together. "It's the only place," she said. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. She turned and walked down the corridor, the feathers catching the light, growing smaller with each step until the corridor bent and she was gone. Dorset stood there a moment longer, holding his tape recorder, in a corridor that still smelled faintly of her perfume and the electric heat of a performance not yet fully cooled. He drove home. He wrote his piece. He left out the sentence. And for the next 50 years, the voice, recorded, permanent, absolutely alive, went on doing what it had always done, finding its way into rooms where someone needed it, touching the thing that ordinary language couldn't reach, giving a specific and irreplaceable sound to the experience of being completely, vulnerably, honestly alive. That is what she left. She was lonely everywhere else, but the music was never lonely. The music was the most inhabited thing in the world, and it still is.